All right, well, the last section of this first half of Mark, mission, we've called it With the Authority of Jesus, the first story that we've now basically completed, the disciples' first mission. They go out. It's a trial run. You see, a test run. They're going to kick the tires, as it were, of the gifts that Jesus has given them. And so we have them going out, and then they return. We see the return, of course, in the narrative before us right now. And in the middle of the story, we hear about the execution of John the Baptist, and we've talked about that. As if Mark wants us to know that while we go out in mission on behalf of Christ, doing anything around the world or around the block, when you act on behalf of Christ, on the one hand, Christ is there ahead of you, preparing the way. Local hospitality can be anticipated, but the gates of hell are going to be putting up a fight, and they don't go down easy. Sometimes John the Baptist gets beheaded, sometimes we face that kind of resistance. And so this is the balance, this is part of this warfare the New Testament tells us we're engaged in. And so this is the first story of this section. From here we now move to the account of the feeding of the 5,000. And that, of course, wants to occupy our attention right now. Then the disciples gathered to Jesus, told him all the things, both that they had done and what they had taught. This is one of two times in Mark's gospel the word apostoloi is used. You know the word apostle, used commonly in the New Testament. Mark only uses it twice. The times he uses it have a kind of symmetry to them. The first time is in chapter 3, where we hear that Jesus, poieo, made the 12. We talked about that last week. It's a creation word. Made the 12, call them apostoloi, call them apostles. So that's when he, in a sense, appoints them, creates them, and now he receives them back. And so these two are the only time they're called apostles. The interesting thing about this word is its history in the Greek language might be a little unexpected to us. The original sense of the word was highly military. In fact, the word originally meant a fleet of ships. So if you go back to the 4th, 5th centuries BC in Greek history, the Peloponnesian Wars, the Persian Wars, other conflicts, you find that the Greeks would often wage their wars at sea, and a fleet of Greek ships would be sometimes called an apostle, sent with authority, sent with a commission. Eventually, the word came to refer to the admiral over the fleet. So originally, it was a word that would be something like, in our thinking, a commander or a general or an admiral or something like that. It had a very distinctive military flavor to it. And by the time we reach the 1st century, that has not gone away. We don't hear that in the word because it's become an English word, and we associate it with the 12 apostles, and we don't know that Greek flavor that lies behind it. But if we were 1st century Greek speakers, we would hear that little hint of a kind of military flavor, a connotation related to the word. And so it's interesting to us that that's the word the New Testament would use to describe these who were sent out on behalf of Jesus. We shouldn't be surprised, because he is, after all, King Jesus, you see. And he comes with a kingdom. And there is a kind of flavor of Jesus coming to take back what is rightfully his, and he's doing it through these that he has commissioned, his generals, if you will, working on his behalf to take back a kingdom that is his. So without overstating it, I don't want to lose that, because actually there's a bit of that flavor that goes through this story as well. These are commanders now, if you can think of it that way, who've come back from their mission, and they tell Jesus all the things that they have done and taught. They're reporting back, you see, to their king. They've gone on the mission, they've been successful. They're probably pretty excited, really, about what's taken place. This is the conclusion of that Markan sandwich. So he sent them out, they come back, and in the middle of the story, John the Baptist is beheaded. So we've talked about that before. This is concluding that and now introducing the next story, which leads us to the feeding of the 5,000. He said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they didn't even have time to eat. All right. Crowd, problem. Let's get away from this. Let's go to a deserted place. Clearly the sense is let's get away from this crowd. We don't even have time for a snack. These people are, pushing and shoving, and we need to escape for a time. So that's the stated premise, really, of the whole story. Come aside and rest. Labor should always be followed by Sabbath. 6 days you shall labor, the seventh day is a Sabbath. There's a rhythm to life. Jesus gives a wonderful example of this. You're well aware of it. I look at a group like this, and you all are laborers for Christ. You all are engaged in various forms of activity and service. God bless you for that. You need to take a break now and then, We can take too much of a break and become lazy, but we can also become irresponsible of our fiduciary obligation to shepherd our resources by never taking a break. The older I get, the more I need to shepherd my resources. Amen? I feel it, And we all have that responsibility. So Jesus gives us a wonderful picture of sensible stewardship of our resources. Make an appointment with yourself. The British journalist Maurice Colburn described George Bernard Shaw in these words, quote, "When seen in the London streets or on the Malvern Hills, he always walks as if he had an appointment with himself and he might be late for it." Make an appointment with yourself, don't be late. You see, there's a place for that. And in some ways, Jesus seems to give us that standard here. Many were coming and going. What is the flavor of that statement? This is not a well-organized group that's methodically following Jesus, taking notes, devoted disciple type. They're coming and going. They're milling. There's no order to them. They kind of stand for the milling chaos of the world. In the Old Testament, the image of that was often the sea, churning, the abyss in constant chaos. It was a place of foreboding from the Jewish point of view, and in some ways it stood for the crowds of the world. And these crowds now really do give us some sense of that same idea. They're so constant in their demands, so unruly, so impolite, that they didn't even have time to eat. You know how crowds can be. They're not thinking about your needs, they're thinking about their own needs, and they're all waiting in line, and they're all pushing around trying to get up close and so on. Mark used this expression, didn't have time to eat, one other time earlier in Mark. It was back in chapter 3, verse 20. And again, he said the crowds were there, they didn't have time to eat, and that was the occasion in which we find the family of Jesus coming from Nazareth to Capernaum and wanting to take hold of Jesus by force, saying he's out of his mind. You remember that story? This is, again, a similar situation. It almost looks as if Jesus needs rescue here because they're so demanding that they don't even have time to eat. And as I say, it kind of carries out that biblical motif of chaos being gradually taken over by order. We find that often in the Old Testament, and here Mark seems to have something of that in his mind as well. So we look at the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and we see behind it this theme. We see, for example, the contrast between the banquet served by Jesus and the banquet served by Herod, which was the immediately preceding story. Herod's feast, self-indulgence. Jesus' feast, quiet satisfaction. In a broader context, up until this moment in Mark's gospel, the crowd has invariably been a negative picture, has invariably been described as that which is troublesome, nuisance, problem. Here it changes. The crowd becomes a crowd in which there's now fellowship. They sit down in groups of 50s and 100s, and there's a kind of quietness about the whole picture. It stands in a broader sense yet for the springboard to the Prince of Peace taking peace to the Gentile world and bringing order there in a place that from the Jewish point of view through history had always been the churning sea, the place of chaos and the place of disorder. So here we go. They departed to a desert place in a boat by themselves. The desert place to which they departed, we're told by Luke, was a place called Bethsaida. This would be the Bethsaida that is in Iturea, outside of Galilee. There was another Bethsaida in Galilee, but this is clearly the one where Jesus takes his disciples. The word means house of fish. It would have been about a 20-mile journey on foot from where Jesus was to Bethsaida. It would have taken a little less time by boat unless these people were really trucking. And apparently that's what they were doing. So they take this little journey by boat. They're going to go to a place of quietness, a little retreat. It's going to be a time of kind of kicking back around the campfire, telling some stories about their recent mission. And the disciples, you can almost hear the groans in their voices, can't you, as they're approaching the shore, and there's that same crowd on the shore. The multitude saw them departing. Many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They gathered there before him and came together to him. We're supposed to go, oh man, can you believe that? Because that's what the disciples said. They looked at that and thought, this is unbelievable. How did they get here so fast, you know? So this demanding, impolite crowd cannot be escaped. But the point of the story is not that Jesus tries to escape them. The crowd that cannot be escaped can be transformed. And it's the transformation of this crowd that becomes Mark's main point in telling the story. This story stands in that chiasm we've talked about earlier. So we've seen, first of all, the inner core of it. This is chapter 6 versus chapter 3. Jesus and his family. The bracket outside of that, Jesus and his apostles. The bracket outside of that, I'm calling this Jesus and his crowds. So you can kind of see a movement outward, not only in the chiasm, but really in the subject matter as well. In the earlier version of the story, when the crowd show up, the disciples function essentially as crowd control. They're bouncers, essentially. In this story, they're servants. So not only is the crowd transformed, but the role of the apostles is transformed as well. Now, I just want to remind you of a couple of details from that earlier text in chapter 3. If we have it in mind, it helps us appreciate the text that's before us here. So chapter 3 now, the earlier kind of setup to our present story. But Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea, and Jerusalem, and Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, and those from Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude, when they heard how many things he was doing, came to him. Notice how many Gentiles are mentioned here. In fact, that's what Mark is emphasizing. It almost seems like there's more Gentiles than Jewish folks coming in this crowd. So he told his disciples that a small boat should be kept ready for him because of the multitude, lest they should crush him. That's how much of a threat this crowd represented. They're coming from all parts of the world, and they're coming with this kind of almost mean-spirited desire to get at Jesus, and there's almost a risk, you see, to his well-being reflected here. For he healed many, so that as many as had afflictions pressed about him to touch him. Can you imagine being surrounded by people who are trying to touch you? You know, I mean, the whole picture just gives you this sense of a kind of a perilous situation. This is chapter 3. If we compare this story in chapter 3 with the present one in chapter 6, some things are kind of notable. In chapter 3, the Gentiles are coming to Jesus. In chapter 6, the story we have before us is the segue to Jesus going to the Gentiles. So that's the first little interesting parallel between them. In chapter 3, the crowds are unruly on steroids. I mean, all of the description of them gives you this feeling that these people are not very nice. By chapter 6, what? They sit down in groups on the green grass. It becomes a lovely picnic. What a change. Chapter 3, The disciples are not much more than bouncers, crowd control in chapter 6. They're servants. The two stories stand in a parallel, but they represent a transformation now of the crowds, and really in some ways tell us what Mark wants us to understand about the influence of Jesus, not only in this moment, but throughout his own era, toward those who are being persecuted by Nero, and I certainly believe to us, who probably feel at times we're living in a bit of a chaos in our culture and in the world. It is also a tale of two banquets put on by two kings. So you've got King Herod last week puts on a banquet. You've got King Jesus puts on a banquet. Herod's banquet started in pride, braggadocio, self-indulgence, lavish promises, ends in humiliation and frustration. Jesus' banquet starts with a couple of loaves and a couple of fish. Pretty humble beginnings, ends in satisfaction. Herod's banquet promises much. I'll give you anything you want, up to half my kingdom. It's yours. I mean, this guy is just over the top in the stuff he's offering. He can deliver nothing. Promises much, delivers little. Jesus promised little. I mean, it wasn't very promising, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Come on. But what does he deliver? Abundance. Herod lost his status, lost his army after this feast. If you can bear it, Jesus enlisted his army as a result of this feast. These generals, these apostoloi, now get 5,000 aner, men. That's a distinctively male word. There's others there, obviously. But Mark wants us to see this as an army of peace. He's a prince of peace. These soldiers are going to fight with the weapons of grace, the Word of God, the works of God. Not the weapons of military armaments, but it nevertheless has that kind of military flavor. As the New Testament often reminds us, our warfare is not against flesh and blood, against principalities, powers, mights, and dominions. You know, that warfare mentality is there, but it's not the warfare of the hardware of this world. It's the hardware of heaven. So, Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude, was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. Well, the other half of your Greek lesson is a word we've seen before. Esplachnithe. You say that? You got to growl it. Esplachnithe. Let's 1, 2, 3. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Esplachnithe. Oh, you're great. You're fluent. See, I've succeeded. You're fluent in Greek. We've talked about the word before. In fact, my subtitle for this whole study of Mark has been Jesus, the man of action and compassion. This is the word compassion. It's a word that refers directly in the Greek language to your guts or your bowels. It's referring to an emotional state that arises out of the depths of the inner pit of who you are, moving you to tears, moving you almost to nausea with a sense of grief with respect to something that you're beholding. That's the force of the word. It's a very strong word, much stronger really than our English word compassion. It had a much more kind of a deep sense of the guts of a human being involved. What's interesting about it is that in the ancient world, this was a scarce commodity. Scarce not only in that you don't have the word used very often, but even when it is used, it's used almost always in a decidedly negative sense. It is not a celebrated quality. So when you read about the great heroes of the ancient world, it would not have been a compliment to say that person was a person of compassion. Julius Caesar was never celebrated because he was compassionate. The great heroes of the Greek and Roman world were not famous because they were compassionate. Indeed, compassion was viewed as that which paralyzes a person and prevents them from being effective. It actually is a form of almost dementia that you are compassionate. It's something to be avoided. The Stoic philosophers of the first century, who are viewed as sort of decent guys, hated compassion. They were Stoics. You don't let yourself be crippled up by these debilitating feelings of pity. Come on. You got to be a man. Stiff face, upper lip, doesn't move. You know, it's got to be that. And if you collapse under the weight of pity, you're lost. Friedrich Nietzsche made the same point in the 19th century. You know, he despised the Christian ethic of compassion. He said we need to rise above the herd morality. We need to become the Ubermensch, the Superman, rising above this Christian, debilitating ethic of compassion. Well, Nietzsche was right up to date if he'd lived in the first century, you know. So Jesus comes along, and he is described repeatedly in the New Testament with a very unexpected word, which would not on the face of it be regarded as a compliment by the early readers of this text, and yet manifestly the New Testament authors not only allow it to be there, they make it one of the defining features of Jesus' character and behavior. Thus, it is a surprising quality. It was surprising to the disciples. They're, taking their boats up to the shore. There's the crowds on the shore. I doubt that any of them were moved with compassion. They were moved with annoyance. They were moved with irritation. They were moved with impatience. But only one of those was moved with compassion. It nevertheless became the defining quality of the Christian movement ever since. And if there's any single word that has described the Christian movement at its best at all times in history, it has been God's people moved with compassion. Compassion. So much so that it has slopped over into the popular culture, and now compassion is viewed as a good thing. And so you have people who want to raise your taxes in the name of compassion. Well, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying, isn't it interesting how compassion has become a dominant virtue when 2,000 years ago that would have been almost absurd beyond belief to make that a virtue. But here it is, that Christian influence originating with Christ. Maybe more common in history has been the comment of Thomas Carlyle, who was a British author, said, "Once the population of England was 30 million, mostly fools." I'm not going to make any comments about 300 million Americans. Nope, I'm not going to go there, but, that has been the tendency, isn't it? Isn't that the tendency? We look at the masses. We look at what some people call the sheeple. We look at people who don't seem to think, 3 inches deep in terms of their view of life or anything else. They just want to tune into the latest sitcom, and we think, Jesus looks at such people and he's moved with compassion because they are, as Mark says, so profoundly sheep without a shepherd. It's a touching image, isn't it, of chaos, confusion, disorder, except that unlike sheep, these sheep without a shepherd had horns, and they were threatening, and they were pushy, and they were a little bit more than just sheep wandering on a hillside. So my picture is much too benign, but you get the idea. Back in ancient Israel, the sheep were supposed to have a shepherd. The priests of Israel were regarded as having a shepherd's role. That was the Old Testament image, at least one of them. They were supposed to be those who reached out and extended some kind of mercy to those who were in need. At the time that these events are happening in the first century, these shepherds have become completely absorbed in themselves. Now, not all of them, but certainly in Jerusalem, the upper echelons of the priestly class lived in the most extraordinary and extravagant wealth. This is well documented. Josephus goes on at length to describe the satisfying lifestyle of these people and the great wealth that they made basically off the temple. That's why Jesus said, "You've made it a den of thieves," These people were living in a level of luxury that paralleled anybody in the Roman world. Some of the wealthiest people, we have good evidence to believe, some of the wealthiest people in the Roman world lived in Jerusalem, and they were priests. That's how much money was coming in. I think the book of Revelation has that in mind in chapter 18 when it talks about merchants lamenting the collapse of the great city of Jerusalem because they've lost this market. All of the products that they love to sell, gold, silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple silk and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, incense, myrrh, and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, bodies and souls of men. And it's documented every one of those products was sold with many, many more in Jerusalem to their wealthy class. And that wealthy class were the people that were supposed to be moved with compassion. In the Old Testament, Ezekiel chapter 34 would be the probably best known critique of priests that had left behind their responsibilities. And however bad things were in Ezekiel's time, they were much worse by the time we get to the first century. Well, history is filled with similar examples. Martin Luther, a little over 500 years ago, went to Rome. 1510 was the year. He thought he was going to see a city of holiness, a city of virtue, a city of saintliness. He was appalled at the level of luxury, slick professionalism, outright visible immorality of every conceivable description, with no interest whatsoever in any sense of shame about this whole thing. He came back to Wittenberg a deeply, deeply disillusioned monk. Many people believe the Reformation really began then, when he saw what looked like the same thing that was happening in the first century. It was 7 years later when he tacked 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door. Well, Jesus began to teach them many things. Jesus serves the crowds with words and works. I love Dick Leon's image. I've mentioned it before. The gospel walks on two legs, words and works. Jesus, before he heals, before he feeds, before he teaches. And he teaches for a while, apparently, because now we find the day is far spent. And the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late." That's a wonderful little turn of phrase, "the day was spent." As near as we can tell, it goes back to William Tyndale, who translated the Bible from Greek into English under the reign of Henry VIII. He was burned at the stake, for his efforts. But anyway, one of the things he did was add all kinds of wonderful little phrases to the English language. The twinkling of an eye is a phrase from Tyndale. The day was spent. The Greek reads, the day was full, and Tyndale realized that wasn't an English idiom, so he actually invented something, and here we have it, and of course we tend to use it in popular conversation. His disciples said, literally, we're repeatedly saying to him, "This is a deserted place." John actually drops a little humor into the narrative. John says that Jesus looked at Philip and said to him, "What are we going to do?" And Philip, "What are you doing?" Jesus asks you, "What are you going to do?" Well, Mark doesn't give us that detail, but you get the flavor that everybody was looking a little perplexed, and maybe even Jesus was looking a little perplexed, just to kind of add some juice to the moment. Well, the disciples come up with a brilliant strategy. Let's get rid of them. Let's send them away, that they may go to the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, because they have nothing to eat. It is an eminently reasonable solution, and by the way, it's a win-win situation. We get rid of the crowds, they can go eat, and we get some peace and quiet, So it's this makes sense no matter how you look at it, Jesus. This is our best strategy. The crisis is here. The disciples are, they think, being pretty compassionate. These people have nothing to eat. This is not a good situation. Let's do something about it. They brainstorm a reasonable solution. Jesus comes back with what is, by anyone's estimates, an outrageous alternative. He answered them and said, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Come again?" That's in the Greek there, you know. You give them something to eat. In fact, there is something in the Greek. It's so wonderful. And it's so hard to translate. But the word humes means you. It wouldn't ordinarily be used unless you wanted to emphasize it. So it's present here. And then it's not only present, but it's placed strategically in the sentence to add even greater emphasis. So if we could bring it over, I'm overstating it slightly, but the flavor of the way the phrase is found in Greek would be something like this. Jesus said to the disciples, "Give them something to eat, and I mean you." You know, I mean you. It's like humes, right at the end of the sentence. No ambiguity here. You give them something to eat. I don't know about you. There are certain phrases that have become part of the Christian lingo that have been so powerful. I don't know of many that could top this one. You know, you give them something to eat. And how much of Christian history has been driven by God's people being touched at their core and moved with compassion over the prospect of feeding a hungry mouth. There are literally thousands of examples, so I'm just mentioning these just to remind you. Francis of Assisi transformed monastic life in his day, coming up with the radical and novel idea that the monks should get out of the monasteries and into the streets to give them something to eat. He spent a lot of his time just fundraising. That's all he did. Going to rich people and asking them for money so he could go out and give people something to eat at a time when grinding poverty tended to be the reality for many folks. Some of you may know the story of Elizabeth of Hungary. She was embattled, her husband died, and she lost the protection of those who should have been closest to her. She had spent her career as a queen in Hungary, giving the hungry something to eat. She was beloved for doing so, and then she lost it all in a political reversal, and she wound up basically as impoverished as the people that she had been serving, and she immediately went out. This woman who had been a queen went out and got a job spinning wool, earned as much money as she could, ate a starvation diet so she could keep giving people something to eat, and she died at an early age because she basically worked herself to death. Amy Carmichael, many of you know her story, and the career she spent giving little children something to eat. George Mueller in England, early 1800s, the Mueller orphanages, he wanted to give these kids who had been ignored and neglected for years in English society, working in the mills of the Industrial Revolution, he wanted to give them something to eat. Albert Schweitzer, who leaves a prestigious post as a New Testament scholar, goes out as an MD and becomes the missionary in Africa, giving them something to eat. One of my recent favorites, who I've mentioned before, Vishal Mangalwadi. If you don't know how to spell his name, then I hope you'll make a note of it here. Vishal Mangalwadi grew up in a Hindu background in India. He's still alive today. He's been in and out of jail multiple times because he is a Christian. And he's spending his career trying to give hungry people in India something to eat. And in the meantime, he's writing books. And the books he's writing are worth reading. The one I just finished is entitled The Book That Made Your World. And in this book, he makes the case, as someone from outside the West, as an Easterner, as a guy from India, telling us, you know what made Western civilization great? You know what made it such a centerpiece of all ideas of civilization? Although we've kind of forgotten it in recent years, but he argues, you know what made it great? It's not this color of people's skins. It's not the natural resources of the land. It's not all kinds of other things we'd like to attribute it to, our native intelligence or any such thing. It is the Bible, he argues. As a guy who grew up in a Hindu tradition, he says, this is your treasure that you are now kind of kicking out the back door of your culture. And he asks the question, is the sun going down on the West because we have abandoned, the Bible? It's a book worth reading. He tells the story how, as a young man in India, before his conversion, he was so impressed with these Hindu Brahman class, people that seemed to just kind of float down the sidewalk, saffron robes, elite, holy, advanced, superior, that upper caste. But he says, even as a young man, it disturbed him that these great advanced types could walk down the sidewalk just feet from children starving to death, literally on the sidewalk right there. They were ignored because they were untouchable. Didn't matter. And he said he was impressed by the fact that it took a Christian, Mother Teresa and others who came with her, a Christian who'd said, I'm going to give these kids something to eat. And something in him loosened the mortar at that point, you see. And he eventually became a Christian, and now he's one of the leading, many people would say he's the leading Christian intellectual in India today. And he's a powerful voice, not only for the Christian gospel, not only for the Bible, but for you give them something to eat. Well, the disciples give a very biblical response, quote, yeah, but. Read in, give me a break. What are you talking about? What do you mean, give them something to eat? Isn't it interesting how often great ideas that we could go do for Jesus crash on the reefs of dollar signs? Isn't that interesting? It just happens, doesn't it, kind of? The disciples did a little mental arithmetic and figured out in modern currency that to give this crowd something to eat would run somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $25,000. That's what 200 denarii would amount to. It's probably more than they had in their little money bag that Judas was carrying there. And so it couldn't even occur. Jesus, we know you can calm the storm. We know you can give sight to the blind. We know you can cleanse the leper. We know you can heal the sick and raise the dead. But, I mean, come on. There's got to be a limit. You know. And so you have this response from the disciples. It is a sarcastic, mocking, crushing reductio ad absurdum aimed at Jesus. This time, the disciples had to have gotten the right answer, you know. Jesus says, well, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. So they went, dutifully found out. You can imagine how they said it. 5. We got 5, oh, and by the way, 2 fish. Okay, point made. You know, you don't just feel what's in the air here. Jesus asks, how many loaves do you have? We invariably fixate on what we don't have. Isn't it true? I don't have much. I don't know much. I can't do much. I can't. We can't. Isn't that kind of the refrain? Jesus never asked the disciples, what is it that you don't have? What are you lacking? You know. When I was probably between the ages of 4 and maybe 9 years old, I had a conversation with my dad at least 10,000 times. It went something like this. I'd ask Dad something or other, and he'd say, okay, fine, but I want you to go do such and so. And I would say, I can't. Seemed reasonable to me. You know. How many times, I can't tell you how many times, he's so patient, he took me, grabbed me by both shoulders, firmly but gently, looked me in the eye, and he said these magic words. You probably can guess them. I can't, never did anything. You ever heard that? Yeah, well, it got engraved in my DNA somehow, you know. That defeatist attitude. And yet, how much of it dictates policy? Jesus asks about what you do have. So I'm going to ask you the question right now. You don't have to answer out loud. I don't want you to answer, but I just want you, what do you have? Not what don't you have. What do you have? You know? Maybe you feel like you've got quite a bit. Maybe you've got not much. But I'm going to tell you, in God's economy, you don't have any more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, period. Regardless of credentials, intelligence, education, you've got 5 loaves, barley loaves at that, and a couple of fish. That's what you've got to work with. Paul is a character you've heard of, plays a role in the New Testament. All descriptions of him in the New Testament, and some that we have from outside the New Testament, describe him as a man who was quite short, had a quite unimpressive appearance, was not handsome, had limited speaking ability, had certain physical impairments that we don't know what they were, but they seem to have caused some people to sort of back away from him. I think it's safe to say that if Paul were trying to get a job in any church in history called St. Paul's something, he wouldn't have gotten the job, you see. St. Paul's Cathedral, St. Paul's whatever. His resources were meager. But those 5 loaves and 2 fish are still echoing. So, even though our resources are meager, the resources of what God can do with them, of course, have no limit. So here we have barley loaves, a couple of fish. John tells us this is the sack lunch of a boy that lives in poverty. And on the basis of that, he commanded them to make them all sit down. That in itself is extraordinary. This crowd it wasn't given to sitting. Sitting is the posture of sanity, which means there's only one person in this room who is insane at the moment. You might note that. But remember the Gadarene demoniac. The townspeople came and found him what? Sitting, clothed, and in his right mind. This crowd that had been a milling, confused mess sits down. They sit down on the green grass. Only Mark tells us the grass was green. It means it was springtime. They sit down in ranks, hundreds, 50s. This is very, very orderly. It was decent and orderly, which becomes compelling proof the disciples were Presbyterians, you see. It's also reminiscent of the Exodus. Moses made quite a point to the Jewish people exiting Egypt. Don't run out in a mad panic. You're going to walk out orderly, heads held high with dignity, and you're going to go out with a kind of military precision. And that description is given to us more than once. In some ways, you see, the whole point is this is being described at a very subtle level as a kind of military discipline, because this is now transforming itself from a milling mass of people who have no order to a military that is going to be with Jesus from this point on. When he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples, set them before them, and the 2 fish he divided among them all. So he looks up to heaven. Every meal, of course, is an expression of God's grace among us. He divided them. There's always been an attempt to naturalize this and say, well, all of the people that had lunches shared with all the people that didn't, but the clear textual force of this is a miracle of stupendous proportions. This isn't people just sort of being moved in their conscience and sharing the sack lunch they had tucked away in their robes, you know. That's at least not the way Mark wants us to take this at all. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. So they gather the food. Interesting detail. One commentator pointed this out. I hadn't noticed it, but it is true. Every chapter in Mark's gospel has something to do with eating. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. There is a reference to eating in every chapter of Mark's gospel. That's probably a little closer. Chapter 1, we hear of John the Baptist and what he ate. Chapter 16, we hear that if you drink any deadly thing, it will not harm you. That's part of the appendix there, but we'll include it. This, however, is far and away the meal that is supposed to be understood as satisfying, bread from heaven, as John develops in such detail. They took up 12 baskets full, been all kinds of attempts, of course, to find the significance of the numbers there. I'm not going to bother you with it. There is a similar scene, however, in 2 Kings chapter 4, where Elisha multiplies food and feeds 100 men. Every miracle performed by Jesus has a precedent in the Old Testament somewhere or other, with the exception of casting out demons. And even this one had a precedent in the Old Testament. Last detail, these are 5,000 men. There's 2 words in the Greek language, both are translated men. One is anthropos, from which we get anthropology and anthropic and those kinds of words. It means man as in human. The opposite of that word would be a non-human. Then there's another Greek word, aner, as in android or something like that, you know. And that is a word that means man as in male, and the opposite of that word is gune, as in gynecology, man as in female, or, you know, female of the species. Mark is quite clear. These are men. Now, we can assume, I think, extrapolate that very likely there were others there. And that's fine, but Mark doesn't care about them. He wants us again to see this as a kind of military force, a benign military that's just been transformed from a rude, uncontrolled crowd into that which is disciplined under Jesus' generals, if you will. They're being given the armaments of the kingdom, which is going to be that which the Prince of Peace will bring to the world, namely peace, order, tranquility, calm. Many of these people were probably those who stood at the triumphal entry and said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." All right, Sunday school lesson. I probably don't need to mention this. Point one, you give them something to eat. Most of you know the name Henrietta Mears, Dr. Henrietta Mears. She was, for many decades, the premier Sunday school teacher, mostly of college students at Hollywood Presbyterian Church. Our own beloved Dale Bruner was in her class, as you probably know. Other major figures of the Christian movement in the 20th century attended her Sunday school class. She was a master of good one-liners, and I love this one. Every person you meet is dying for a drop of love. Every person you meet. You give them something to eat. It may be literally, it may be metaphorically. You may say, well, I don't have much. Jesus doesn't care about what you don't have. He asks, what do you have? What do you have? A little time? Presence? It's a gift from God to look somebody in the eyes and just be present with them for a moment. That's a great gift. A Bible verse? A touch, running an errand, giving a buck or two, a couple of loaves, a couple of fish. Jesus commands, sit down on the green grass. The effect of you giving what you have in Jesus' name will be in some small measure to replace the chaos in this world with calm. We live in a chaotic world. We're surrounded by people whose lives in many cases are just tragically chaotic. You know that. People can mess their lives up. Oh, you know that, don't you? Some of you are close to people and you just can't believe how they've messed their lives. Well, the mess is here. Satan made a mess of things and he's still doing the best he can. The only remedy, however, is not beating people into submission. It is giving them a word of Christ, a morsel of bread, a look, a touch. Give them something to eat. Give them something of what you have. And we become those reconciling agents of the grace of God. Paul says in Colossians, "For it pleased the Father that in him all fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his Christ." You are the cutting edge of God's reconciling effort in this world when you give them something to eat. And so I hope that is inspiring to all of us as we go about the business of serving King Jesus.